Hello, beautiful community. You're very welcome to this conversation about the drone panic in Russia and also about further thoughts about who done it, about the Kremlin drone attack. So, the drone panic is one of the three takeaways I have emphasized from the drone attack. The other two takeaways being, first, that the war will increasingly materialize on Russia's soil in 2023. We've discussed this endlessly, so we don't need to say more. And the second point I emphasize is that at this point, Ukraine is interested in escalation. Ukraine is interested in unpredictability. Russia is not. Russia is interested in freezing the war, waiting until Western willpower exhausts itself and we are tired of supporting Ukraine. Wait until our democracies deteriorate. Then attack again in 2026, 2028. And attack again, not just Ukraine, but the West's place on the international order, and that might mean even attacking a NATO state and challenging Article 5. So at the moment, the more global a story the war becomes, the more this benefits Ukraine, the more the story recedes into the background, the more this benefits Russia. The third takeaway then is this sort of drone panic. How is that an interesting takeaway? Well, even apart from the Kremlin drone attack, there have been all of these explosions all over Russian territory, and in particular, many drone sightings in the Moscow area. And I'm hearing that sometimes there are police call-outs as frequently as 100, 200 times a day with reported drone sightings. Most of them are bogus, but some of them potentially are real. So there's a real concern about all these things in the sky. Now, how is this significant? It's significant because if Ukraine's counteroffensive produces moderate or disappointing results, this drone campaign gives Ukraine another lever for impact. Now, it's impact with unpredictable circumstances because you could destabilize the Putin regime this way, but you could also consolidate it this way. So it's hard to know what the outcome is, but it is nevertheless another lever that the Ukraine could pull, even if they feel that they run out of levers on the battlefield. If at some point we reach a situation where Ukraine's made some progress, but then the situation is frozen. So I think this is a significant chance of a partial ticket for Ukraine out of stalemate if they reach stalemate. A disappointing kind of stalemate. So now, let's say a little bit about who done it. Now, of course, it's not aliens and it's not NATO. So the candidates include, number one, an agency of the Ukrainian state operating from Ukraine or from inside Russia. Number two, a Ukrainian group, a pro-Ukrainian group operating from inside Russia. Number three, Z radicals. Number four, an anti-Putin, anti-war opposition group. A Russian anti-Putin, anti-war opposition group, liberal democratic opposition. And number five, the Kremlin. Now, I haven't gone to bed yet since yesterday. I did a very early interview on BBC Radio Wales this morning about the drone attack and the counter offensive. And so the chances that I'm going to remember the 5 points the 5 causes I've just listed are nearly zero. So let's just see how we go. Let's start with the Z radicals. You know everything, right? The Z radicals are Putin's main opposition in Russia in 2023. They have about 20% of the population that may support them. You know some of these figures. You know the neo-romantic imperialist fantasist Mr. Girkin. And here's why I'm very skeptical that they could have done it. But I'm not going to tell you to take it 100% off the scale. But these folks are an organic movement, or at least a set of family resemblances, a set of movements with family resemblances that sort of hang together. But they're not just conflictual between themselves, they're also highly enmeshed with agencies of the Russian state. So the chances that any grouping of them I can think of could have put this together without being exposed seem extraordinarily small. And then moreover, one feature of these folks is that they know Putin well, and they know that something like that would not make him dramatically change course. Putin reacts to events by accelerating, slowing down things he's doing, by changing the order in which he wants to do things, but he does not like changing course just because something has happened. I mean, just look at him now. He's still trying to win this war. I'm just going to get this. My apologies. So they wouldn't have thought that Putin would be thrown off course by something like this. And what would they like to do? Well, they'd like him to take action. Well, what action do they want him to take? Because he can't do much more in Ukraine without using non-conventional weapons. Well, what they would like him to do is dramatize the totalitarian turn at home, put the country on a path more reminiscent of things in the 1930s. Now, therefore, I advise a heavy dose of skepticism. So the other candidate might be the anti-Putin, pro-democratic Russian partisans. The trouble with that, very roughly speaking, is that they don't exist. And if they exist, there isn't a great deal of evidence for activity they're engaged in. Now, there are people outside of Russia who are claiming these are eminently real, or even claiming to be in charge of them. But the evidence that this stuff is going on is very limited. And if I were to name all the possible people I can imagine in Russia from that demographic, and that demographic is real, most of their leaders are overseas or in jail in Russia, but there are still these 20 to 30 million people in Russia who do subscribe to a strongly anti-war position, but they don't perceive themselves as having any political course of action available to them, or any revolutionary course of action indeed. So that activity could be there 6 months from now. I just don't see it. So I'm going to say it won't. I'm going to say it won't them on this. Now, in terms of the Kremlin, well, we've just said that the Kremlin is not interested in escalation now. It wants escalation later. It's also clear that the Z radicals aren't going to be transformed by this kind of action in any way, and neither will the anti-war folks. So the question is, what will it then do that the Kremlin could feel advantaged by in terms of the depoliticized blob in the middle? Could this be an effort to try to activate them in some way? there is no evidence that the Kremlin is now interested in any kind of dramatic step in that direction. Nor is it clear that this has made much of a difference at all, to be fair. So I'm doubtful that there's much to that thinking. Again, in Ukraine, the Kremlin wouldn't expect an event like this to change much. They're doing whatever they can anyway. They're not planning to make a nuclear attack on Ukraine. The least weak case for the Kremlin is what I mentioned in the main channel video, which is that this would be visceral imagery of Ukraine attacking Moscow, which is something the West doesn't want them to do, which is therefore something that Western citizens would not be impressed by, and would make Ukraine look less of an ethically pure party in this conflict. That's more plausible than expecting a totalitarian turn from this, or expecting something different in Ukraine, but it's not enormously powerful. What's striking is that I think about 60% of the involved internet thinks that this was a false flag operation. That's to say, that people who consume content about the war extensively. In terms of Russia experts, probably about 95% are highly skeptical that this was a false flag. And partly that's, I think, that perception is dramatized by the way people with a lot of experience of the Putin regime observe their reaction, which had the familiar taste of them trying to work out how to cast this. At first they wanted to play it down, then they wanted to overplay it, and then they wanted to take it off the shelf again. And you could feel to some extent them wondering, well, how much shall we push the total war story here? That we're now transcending the special military operation. Shall we take this a bit further? Is this not the right time? They decided it wasn't the right time. So I think people sensed indecision and a lack of readiness in that response. And the other thing that people who know Putin well know is that he would absolutely personally feel the huge sense of impotence and humiliation that this attack manifests, which makes it hard to imagine how he would sanction this. And over and above that, if you know Putin well, Putin would have done a false flag attack by blowing up an airport, blowing up a train station, a bus station, or even a hospital. And that is very naturally Putin, and you would have wanted civilian casualties there. And so most country experts don't quite recognize it and quite see it. So my advice is not to take the false flag story off the table, but do be aware that the balance here dramatically changes the more you look to people with real expertise. And of course, the Russia experts are the people who would know the technical details that are available to us too. In fact, they'd know more. They'd know, exactly which. Well, I know that too. In fact, exactly which room is in underneath which bit of the Kremlin. So that's the situation. Now, there was one authoritative body that released the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, that released a short report, rapidly released it, saying that it was likely a false flag operation. And I mean, they were roundly criticized. And it wasn't just an error, but it was an it was a professional ethical failing on their part. Not just because it could have been a false flag hypothetically, right? But in their case, that conclusion just didn't follow from any argument they made. Moreover, these were folks with expertise that was quite different to what you needed to make this judgment. I mean, these were mapping professionals evaluating something that required, to a lesser extent, military expertise, and to a much greater extent, political insight and political understanding, of which there was none in that report. So now we're left with Ukraine, and we're left with a pro-Ukraine group in Russia. And I don't want to legislate on this, except to say that quite certainly it is a project, it is a program for the Ukrainian state to bring the war home to Russians. And in terms of Ukrainian groups, it's clear that the interpenetration between two countries is enormous. I mean, that's how Russians managed to wreak so much havoc in Ukraine. And if us here in Britain wanted to get things to happen on Russian territory, just couldn't do it. But Ukraine can. There's so many people in Russia who are going to happily act in the interests of the Ukrainian state. So there we go. Don't feel pushed by what I've said, because really this is not a hill to die on. You wanna think it's a false flag story. Think it's a false flag story, and just take whatever is constructive out of the conversation I've had. I don't want to overpress you on this, but I think it was healthy for you to hear some of the things that I shared in this, once again, particularly rambly way. Lots of love. Talk soon.